During the Second World War, one of the most successful resistance groups was the French resistance, who played a huge part in the liberation of France from Nazi occupation. They were known for carrying out large-scale sabotage attacks upon the occupiers, and they were supported by the British and Americans. Their numbers grew into the hundreds of thousands during World War II, and they themselves executed many of their enemies, including members of the SS and the Wehrmacht, but also their enemies within the French population, such as members of the milice or the militia. But if captured, members of the French resistance also faced brutal and ruthless actions by the Germans, and on the 21st of February 1944, there were 25 members of the French resistance who were taken to Mont Valérien inside of a fort, where a German firing squad executed them ruthlessly. This is a story of those members of the French resistance who were executed that day. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The French resistance was made up of men and women who refused to accept defeat, collaboration and submission to the German war effort. They were hostile to the Vichy French, who were in the pockets of the Nazis, and they got involved in many different actions. They began to stockpile and hoard weapons, ammunition and vehicles that had been abandoned as the French soldiers began to retreat to the north, following the Germans' blitzkrieg into France, and they would later use these in sabotage and demolitions against the German enemy. They caused absolute chaos and lots of trouble too, stealing Wehrmacht signs, and they also let the tyres down on military vehicles, as well as cut telephone cables, and even attacked significant infrastructure being used by the Germans, such as the railway networks. The resistance became properly structured as the war went on, and they began to expand into different networks supported by organisations such as Special Operations Executive, the British SOE. But they were conducting their work in secret, and the networks began collecting more and more information, and they gained a lot of support amongst the French population. Demonstrations and strikes took place in cities against the German authorities, but if they were captured, members of the resistance often faced brutal reprisals at the hands of the German occupiers. The usual course of action for those who fell into the hands of the enemy was that they would be locked up inside of a Gestapo prison, and they would be tortured brutally for information. Most members of the group gave absolutely nothing or very little over, but the Germans wanted information about their activities and who was also involved in the resistance. Torture could sometimes be so brutal that some members of the French resistance were even killed by their ordeals, but if the individual gave over little or nothing, then they would often be either sent to a concentration camp or extermination centre, or they would then be executed rather swiftly and quickly, sometimes even in public. One place which became synonymous with the executions of members of the French resistance was Mont Valérien. This is a fortress inside of Paris, and it was specifically used for executions during World War II. The Germans would bring victims to the prison or fortress in the back of a truck from different sites all across Paris and further afield, and they were then held inside of a disused chapel for a short time period before the victims were marched out to a clearing 100 metres away. This was a firing range, and the victims were shot by a firing squad before their remains were then taken to different cemeteries in Paris to be buried. Inside of the fortress, over 1,000 hostages and members of the resistance were executed by the Nazis, and some do estimate and say that the number executed may even be as high as 4,500. But on the 21st of February 1944, there were 25 members of the French resistance who were executed at Mont Valérien. Amongst the group were 3 young high school students who had been condemned to death for guerrilla activities and involvement in a murder, presumably the murder of a German official or a soldier. The other 22 victims were members of a resistance network which had been dismantled by the Gestapo and the local collaborationist police force inside of Paris. One of the leaders of this group, Misak Manouchian, a poet and communist activist who had carried out bombings and assassinations in the region of Paris, became very well known. He was incredibly popular within the resistance, and when the Nazis captured him, it was a coup for them. Manouchian is today considered a hero of the French resistance, but he and many members of his network were transported to Mont Valérien fortress for their deaths. They had been brought to trial 6 days before, and this was ultimately a show trial, as it was obvious what was going to happen. The point of this trial was for the Germans to create propaganda around them and against them, and posters denouncing the group as saboteurs were published all over Paris. There were 15,000 posters put up across France, but the fates of these fighters only galvanised the resistance. Inside of prison, Misak Manouchian wrote his final words: "Today it is sunny. I look at the sun and the beauty of the natural world I so loved, as I bid farewell to life and to you all, my beloved wife and dear friends." He signed off a final letter and declared his love for France, before he was then taken under the cover of nightfall, along with the other condemned 24 members of the resistance, to Mont Valérien. The men were brought forward to their executions in groups, and they waited inside of the chapel, and they would have heard the gunshots crashing outside the fortress. In groups, the men were led out, and they made the 100-metre walk to the clearing, where the firing squad were readied and assembled. The men were then made to stand against an embankment, which protected from ricochets, and the German firing squad were commanded by a senior officer, who then told his men to raise their weapons towards their targets. The executioners were ruthless in their actions, and when directed they fired into their targets. It's assumed that the man in charge of the firing squad would be the one who offered a coup de grace gunshot to the head of those men who had not been instantly killed. In groups the men were all shot, and then their bodies were buried in different sites. It was a ruthless set of executions that day, and there were a few photographs taken which showed Manouchian and his resistance group facing the firing squad. These photographs had been taken in secret, and the condemned men did not know that the photographers were there. It showed the true fates of the executed, and it was harrowing. The condemned were stood in front of the stakes, and they were tied to them. They also had white blindfolds placed over their eyes, so they could not see what was happening. The wooded area also concealed the executions from people in the nearby region. Now, what is striking about these specific executions is the sheer amount of German soldiers who were involved in the firing squad. There were dozens of them who were stood with their rifles raised in their full uniforms, including helmets and long coats, and they then shot into their assigned targets. From looking at one of the images, it's possible to see that one poor fellow has 6 German soldiers pointing their weapons at him whilst he was tied to the stake. The commander of the firing squad is also stood behind, directing the proceedings. The executions of the French resistance fighters that day, on the 21st of February 1944, showed the true ruthless brutality of the German soldiers and the Nazis, who seriously believed that the resistance were a huge threat inside of towns and cities. Months later, the liberation of France would slowly begin as the D-Day landings took place, and these men, who had given their lives to the cause, were part of helping France gain its freedom from the Nazi and German occupation. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.